What's up guys, Maxim here, back again with another Academy FM tutorial. And in this tutorial I will be going over different ways of making sure that your bass translates onto smaller speakers, phones, earpods, all these different areas and all these different ways of consuming music. And for most people on the planet, the only way of consuming music, say it be a laptop speaker or something that comes when you buy a phone. And a big part of this has to do not only with what you do as a mix engineer, but I'm gonna use a principle and call it the two different hats here. And the first hat you'd have to put on is as the producer. So if you're producing a song, which octave am I playing my 808s in, or which octave do I have my bass in? What notes am I selecting? Even as far as going to selecting a different key for a track, because the kick drum translates better on a higher note than, say, on a lower one. So all these different musical choices are something you have to take into consideration when you're trying to go for a solid translation and unified, basically leveling out the playing field in this manner. So an example of this, for example, is having an 808 which is playing in a really, really low region. You're just not going to get as great of a sound out of that, or it's not going to translate at all. You might have it, say, hear it in a club. The same works for subs and basses and kick drums. Is if you have a really, really subby kick or a lot of sub, which you're, say, using as your bass, unless that's playing in a club or really good headphones slash speakers, no one is going to ever hear that. And it's probably going to also eat up a lot of headroom and not really be super suited for the groove itself. So I always recommend making sure that when you have basses or kick drums or any bass element, that those are also really, really present in the upper regions of the frequency spectrum. And one of the things that I just mentioned again is you can just go by notes, because the higher you go up the note spectrum, the higher the frequency also gets. So when you go by fundamentals, say you're playing an 808 at a very, very low octave, somewhere down here, no one's really going to be able to hear that, and that's not really what we want, right? So as we go up the octaves, the sound obviously becomes a lot easier to hear for us. This has to do, one, with the Munson curve. As sounds basically go into a certain range of the frequency, we need less decibels to actually hear that sound. You could go ahead and check that out online if you're more interested in how exactly that curve, what exactly that curve looks like. But essentially all that tells us that, one, we have to start mixing on quieter volumes, or at least check the mix on lower volumes. And two is that essentially we're probably going to have to make sure that our sounds that we're using aren't in very, very low octave ranges. So that's a very artistic choice and something that you're just going to have to decide when you're producing a track, because whatever you do then, that kind of determines how much work you're going to have to do in the mixing, or if you're even able to do stuff as a mix engineer. And there are different ways of going about doing things as a mix engineer when it comes to making basses translate or just be able to be heard, say, even in the mid-range. The mid-range being possibly the most important band in all of the different frequency spectrums, since that's the one band that, no matter how crappy your speaker or incredible it is, that mid-range is always going to be there. So low end and top end is obviously very important, but essentially it's all about the mid-range. And how you could make a bass kind of stick up into that mid-range a bit more is, one, you could, of course, if you're, say, mixing, you can apply plugins, say Max Bass by Waves or R Bass or stuff like that, which is basically going to, in a sense, duplicate the sound or take those frequencies and mask them and put them at a higher frequency range so you can mix them in that. That all works fine, psychoacoustics, if you will. But in this sense, we're going to go for something more applicable for guys that might not have those plugins. So what I'm talking about here is the sense of distortion and compression, all those different things, which can really make a sound just pop out of your speakers a bit more. And what I'm talking about here is essentially harmonic distortion. So This being anything from running a sound through, say, a tube or transformer, or even when you're sound designing in Serum, for example, using the distortion module to add just a bit of crispiness and extend the harmonic. So let's see what that would sound like, in this case, on an 808. So as you can see, the 808 in this case is already at a very, very low octave, which can sometimes lead to, again, translating issues. And of course, you could just simply tell yourself that, okay, I'm just going to put all of this an octave higher, and that's going to solve all my problems. And in a sense, yes, it probably would when it comes to bass translation. But of course, you also want to make sure that the sound of the bass is still in line with what you're going for. So I don't want a bleepy 808, for example. This to me just doesn't sound like an 808 as much anymore. So I'm going to keep it in the lower ranges, and just as a mix engineer, think about different varieties or options available to me, how I can make that bass translate more into the mid-range. And one of those is harmonic distortion. So setting up a quick distortion module in Serum here, or even say using stuff like downsampling and stuff like that to just make it a bit more crispy. So that's harmonic distortion for you right there. And oftentimes when you're working in solo with all of these different instruments, that might sound really, really crappy by itself, but then in a track, it'll work really well. So we're going to go back to just slapping this on here, making sure that we're cutting off the very high frequencies because I don't want all of that distortion sound in there. Basically making sure that it starts cutting out at around 800 hertz, which is for me basically where the bass has to be the most present in a sense when we're talking about where it's placed in the mid-range. So you can see that's a nice filthy 808 right there, and you can taper that back too. And then the next thing added in with that is something like some form of compression. And there are obviously different varieties of compression available to me. I personally really like, for example, an LA2A or an LA3A or something like that on a bass sound, since that also lengthens the sound nicely. But you can emulate those kind of sounds here. And let's just quickly add, with this simple compression setup here, a rather slowish attack and a rather fast release, making sure that we're lengthening the sound, and this will again just bring out a bit more of those harmonics that we just added. So it's beefing the sound up a bit more. And there are also obviously a lot of different ways that you can go through. You can be really creative. You can, especially in Serum, you can go ahead and add different filters. You can, especially there's one called Add Bass, and different filters, and just drive them and all that. And that's all part of saturating a sound. And of course, you can just go ahead and use something like a very simple Ableton preset on the saturator, for example, to achieve very similar results. And this is just all going to help beef up the sound a bit more. So everything's just really, really getting a lot more present, and you can already start feeling that the 808 is probably going to be translating a lot better than it did before. And if you want to go really overboard, Camel Crusher is still probably the best plugin to take a sound that was not heard before and then make it heard in the bass range. So let's see what this does. This is going to be pretty drastic. So yeah, as you can hear there, now stuff is really starting to pop out. And this is partly due to just the tube distortion that we're applying here as well. And of course, the amount of compression. It's also adding a bit of gain and all that. So that's just really adding a nice bit of pop. And just for the sake of it, let's go ahead and play this in this little beat here and see what the difference is between one and the other. So let's go ahead and play it processed. And let's go ahead and take all of this off real quick. And of course, you could say that this isn't an exact fair comparison since there's a lot of added volume too, but if we're just going to beef the volume, I can tell you that the more we beef this up, the more just of the unwanted frequencies we're going to add, just trying to hear the 808, and it's just going to eat up so much headroom. So you can feel the 808 is just becoming way too loud, but we're still not even getting any of the harmonics in. We're still not getting what we essentially want. You see that? That's a totally different ballgame right there, just that bit of distortion. And the same also goes for all kinds of different instruments. For example, here, say a bass guitar, we're just running this through a transformer in a sense. An emulation of it, basically what it would sound like to run a through transformer, and that again is extending the bass. And how we can also check if you're extending the bass properly is there are different plugins that help you with this. One I like is Mix Checker, which emulates the room and also EQ curves of all different kinds of things, from smaller, like the Oratones, for example, to just different phones, laptop speakers, even a car, and earbuds. So you can go ahead and check that out, and that's one way to really see how you're keeping in line. But I hope that really some of these tactics that you can just apply them and also think to yourself, making sure that, okay, where I'm placing stuff, say in an octave range, is essentially going to determine how easily that's going to be heard across the spectrum. And if you don't want that characteristics, then you can go ahead and play around with these different tools, harmonic distortion being my favorite out of all of them, to really almost not, I wouldn't say subtly, but just in a very friendly manner, especially when you have a busy track, you can save yourself a lot of headroom and you can really add that top range of harmonics in there, which you just need to translate into these different systems. So if you want to make yourself a plugin in the sense, or if you want to make yourself an emulation of what this might sound like to have a plugin like this, just go ahead and isolate the mid-range band, because that's going to be your safe bet. That's going to be what you want to make sure translates the best. So something like this, and let's see how that translates. So as you can hear, no matter how much I pump the volume up on this, it's just not going to come through. But if we're going to throw on all these different things here, take the volume back a bit, instantly you can hear that fundamental note, which you just did a few seconds ago. And you're basically just isolating the mid-range here. And this will give you a very similar result to what this mix checker would with different curves, only that this offers you a lot more variety. But essentially this is all you really need to check how everything's going to sound on different systems. And of course, keep in mind that even if your mid-range sounds awesome, you're still going to have to mix your low end properly and your high end, of course. But this essentially is one of those parts of the frequency spectrum that I feel like a lot of people just don't pay much attention to, since they're so focused, especially in EDM music, they're so focused on their low end and top end, and that's all fine and good. But if your mid-range sucks, your track's just going to suck, and that's basically it. Let's go ahead and just play through what a simple transformer would do to, say, a quick bass guitar, and then check out this audified mix checker in the process of that. Harmonic Distortion, a world of difference. Go ahead and check it out for yourself. I hope this helped you guys, and I hope that you can go ahead and use these little tricks for your own tracks to make sure that they're enjoyed on all kinds of different audio mediums.